And now, Warming Center Wednesdays with the Flathead Warming Center and KGEZ's John Hendricks, where we tackle hard conversations around the complex causes of homelessness and discuss how we as a community can collaborate to address them.
And from the Warming Center today, we're going to be talking with John Rausch. This time, we're really in your ballpark when it comes to addiction.
Yep, we're going to talk about addiction, the disease of addiction, and how that correlates with the people we see coming into the Warming Center.
How would you define addiction and the disease of addiction?
Well, the disease of addiction has many different symptoms, and that's kind of what I was going to go over today. It's a disease, and it's the way that the substance affects somebody, whereas somebody who doesn't have the disease of addiction isn't going to have the same experience when they use substances. With somebody who has the disease of addiction, the use of substances takes on a much more powerful effect in the person's life. When I talk about substances, I'm talking about drugs and alcohol.
So, drugs and alcohol, let's get right to it. First of all, how do we get into this mess?
What happens with somebody who has the disease of addiction is everybody at some point, or a majority of the people in society at some point will use a substance, whether that be take a drink, smoke a little pot, or use something else. A majority of us will experiment. Some of us it won't do anything for us. We'll put it down, or we may just use it on occasion, to celebrate something or at a social occasion. Others may, there's a substance abuser who may be having a situation in life, like a problem, like a divorce or loss of a job or some significant grief. And they just start using more at that time to kind of address that situation. But once they resolve that situation, they may go back to more controllable use. Somebody with the disease of addiction, when they use, it takes on when they first use a substance, it takes on a very powerful effect, kind of what's called the wow factor. And it gives them some type of relief or comfort or feeling that seems like the solution. So somebody who has the disease of addiction, a lot of times a lot of these people feel like they're just missing something. Something's missing. They don't measure up. So there's just something that feels wrong in them. And in the disease of addiction, something that feels like it's missing in them from being a whole person, that's called a spiritual void or spiritual malady. So what happens is when they start using substances, all of a sudden they can feel normal, or they can feel okay. There's something that's missing is gone temporarily while they're under the influence of that substance. So it begins to take on a much higher priority in their lives, and in their thinking, which is called the mental obsession, which is part of the disease of addiction. And all of a sudden it starts to dominate their thinking and their time, and it takes a larger and larger piece of their lives.
So let me understand here, when you say that makes them feel normal, what about an observer? Would they observe that person appearing to be normal?
No.
Yeah.
Somebody under the influence doesn't appear to, you can tell they're under the influence. The more somebody uses, the more intoxicated they're going to seem. Depending on the different substances, have different symptoms of intoxication, but you see more pronounced symptoms of each substance use as the person uses more of the substance. So no, the person from the outside is not going to see somebody who seems to be sober, but when the person with the disease of addiction uses, this sense of something's missing in me, this sense of I'm not uncomfortable, I'm just uncomfortable in my own skin, is gone temporarily. And that is why they develop their addiction starts to spin out of control.
You mentioned here a spiritual void or a malady. Help us understand that.
It's something that's termed in the disease of addiction. Spirit is kind of how we connect to the world around us, as well as, our spiritual connection with a higher power or with God. That's all part of spiritual, but also a human spirit is just kind of how we fulfill ourselves as human beings and how we connect to the world around us and how connected we feel. And when we're talking about spiritual void, it's almost not like being not a whole person. Something's missing. They don't know what it is that's missing. It's just that something's missing. They're just not comfortable in their own skin. They may feel like they don't measure up to other people. They may be uncomfortable being around other people. These are all part of the spiritual malady and the spiritual void.
So it's this that is the gap that gets filled with the alcohol or the drugs, but the rest of us may not even be aware of that malady.
This is true. Yeah, this is what's happening, and most of us are not aware unless you have had some education on the disease of addiction. Most of us are not aware of the spiritual side of things, the spiritual void or spiritual malady. However, the interesting thing enough is when addiction progresses, that sense of relief starts to leave, and then the addiction creates its own destruction. And as the addiction creates its own destruction, that creates more emotional pain. And the person with the addiction, what they do to relieve that pain by the things that, creates guilt, shame, based on the things they're doing during their addiction, the person uses more to cover, to kind of medicate all that, to relieve all that. So it becomes, the person no longer feels good. They start to just use to feel normal. We're not feeling this pain. And the more somebody uses, and then becomes this addictive cycle, and then they sober up and they've made some poor choices and they have more consequences and they're feeling guilty and shameful and their self-esteem is affected, then they just want to use more to medicate all that, and it becomes this vicious cycle. And I think that's where we see a lot of individuals who may come to the warming center who are experiencing homelessness have reached the bottom of this cycle, of the addictive cycle. They're reaching the bottom rungs of this cycle where they're lots of consequences due to their use. They're losing everything in their lives. They're losing their family. They're losing their relationships. They're losing their jobs, their income, shelter, vehicles, everything. And then somebody at a very severe stage of addiction who's in this cycle and continues to use to try to feel normal when they're experiencing all this guilt and shame and emotional pain. Somebody gets to the very low rungs of that, ends up in a situation where they're homeless.
So maybe we think we can control all of this. We'll ask John if that's even possible after this.
Do you need a refresh on your logo or company branding? InstiPrints is home to 3 amazing graphics designers, each with their own unique style and here to help you with your new look. Michelle, Robin, and April are not only talented, they work efficiently, providing savings to your marketing budget. Give InstiPrints a call at 406-752-8812 to set up a time to visit with one of our design team. InstiPrints, where graphics and printing come together to make you look good.
And today my guest is John Rausch, who is an addictions counselor and working now with the Warming Center. John, can somebody use just enough or drink just enough to control their lives and get what they need?
People who don't have the disease of addiction can. People who are not suffering from addiction can. There's people who have controllable use. I mean, certainly there's people who can go out and have a drink or two, a celebration, and never have a consequence. Put it down, go home, don't think about it again. However, somebody with the disease of addiction, because of this mental obsession and the effects it has, and then this addictive cycle that I talked about earlier, somebody that has a disease of addiction cannot use controllably. Because the addiction is always calling to them, and they start to have cravings, a consistent desire to use. And as they're using, all they can think about is using more to keep whatever feeling they're getting from the drug or the alcohol going. So they just think about using more and more and more. So that's where it spins out of control. They don't have the ability to set limits. They don't have the ability to keep it at a safe use or manageable use. It's called unmanageability. When we talk about Alcoholics Anonymous call that unmanageability. When they talk about their first step, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. That is what they're referring to, is that they can't control their use. The use continues to drive them. That's the disease of addiction. So even though they're thinking, I'm going to go to the bar and have two, once they start drinking, that feeling is so relieving for them, and they have emotional pain from their addiction that they've created. Along the way, guilt, shame as their addiction gets worse, and they just need to not feel that. They continue to use more and more and more, and they don't ever adhere to these limits. They just blow past them, and then more consequences happen because of that.
So this is definitely a progressive disease. It starts out small and mushrooms.
Yes, it's a progressive disease. It's a lot like, I like to, in my past analogies, when I was doing education on this, I'd like to compare it to cancer. It starts out in an area as stage 1, and it spreads. Well, the disease of addiction spreads in its own way. You start out with, small consequences and maybe small moments where it's out of control, and eventually the consequences get bigger and more often, and use spins totally out of control.
So this sounds like a formula for homelessness.
It's part of homelessness. It's definitely part of home. And we've talked about co-occurring disorders. So people with mental illness and addiction at the same time, and those two conditions and how the disease of addiction relates to something like schizophrenia, which we just talked about, they're dealing with some pretty significant symptoms and conditions that need to be stabilized before they can start to improve their situations. And a lot of people end up, their lives are so impairing by addiction or by mental illness that they end up in a position where they're unable to maintain housing. They're unable to have the resources. They're unable to function. And when a person becomes unable to function due to mental illness or addiction, they're probably at some point going to lose everything and lose their housing and end up in a situation where they're homeless and experiencing homelessness on the streets.
Well, this could be a fatal situation.
It can be fatal. I mean, there's certainly, in addiction, it can kill. Certainly there's people driving under the influence can end up killing themselves or somebody else. There's overdoses, alcohol poisoning. There's accidents that happen while people are under the influence. That's where those diseases can be fatal. There's violent situations that occur. Basically, when somebody's using substances and is impaired, they're at risk for possibly being in very dangerous situations. So
when they come to the warming center, and obviously they're homeless at this point, and you determine that that this person has got some type of addiction, what's your step? I usually will, if it seems like somebody has an addiction, I will work with that person to try to help them see problems they're having related to their use. And I will refer to a treatment agency like Western Montana Mental Health Center. PACT has both mental health and addictions. Manny Rivers has addictions. Greater Valley Health Center, Cedar Creek. We've referred to in the past to recovery, to even people who might need inpatient, to recovery centers in Montana. We've worked with Rimrock and Billings on doing some screening for people. So we will do our best to connect that person with the right resources to get the full evaluation that they need and start getting the treatment that they need for their condition. So I guess my takeaway here is that when we talk about homeless, it's more than just go get a job.
Yeah, that's usually not the case. It's usually Yeah, in most circumstances, yes, we want to support them and help them in obtaining that employment, but a lot of times they come to us, they're not ready to walk right out and just look for employment right away. There's other things that need to take place first,
And it
such
sounds
as
like,
treatment for mental health and addictions.
and I get the impression that this is a long road of recovery.
Recovery is a slow process, both in terms of mental health and in terms of addictions. It's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight.
All right. Warming Centers, John Rausch. John, thanks so much for all you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another Warming Center Wednesday. Did you miss it, or would you like to share it with friends? Find today's and past shows via flatheadwarmingcenter.org.